I would now like to introduce Kevin Cramer. Kevin is the founder and chief scientist for Sapio Sciences, and Sapio is an organization that is at the forefront of the digital lab with its integrated lab information management system and electronic laboratory notebook solution. So Kevin will speak to us today on ELN, or LIMS, disappearing boundaries in life sciences. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Zahi. Appreciate it. And thanks for everybody for attending my presentation today. I got a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to talk kind of fast, so I apologize for that in advance, but hopefully it's informative. So ELN or LIMS, disappearing boundaries in life sciences, is the topic today. So a little bit of history. I had to do some research myself to kind of go back to the roots of things, starting with LIMS. What's an acronym for Laboratory Information Management System. And, where did this all begin? If we look back into history and doing some research, I found that there was discussion around laboratory management systems back in 1973, discussed by ASTM. At that time, you can imagine the information systems technology was rather poor. So even though conceptually somebody had thought about this, there really wasn't the ability to actualize that because the information systems really weren't in place to support, programming a system to track lab workflows. So it took all the way another decade really until the first system came out, which was called Generation 1 LIMS. I don't think anybody's using that today. But what's interesting is about when they talked about LIMS at that time, they talked about lab automation, which is tracking instruments and process. And that's the same thing we talk about today. In fact, some vendors talk about it like it's never been done before, but actually conceptually, this was all the way back to 1982. It's been done. So this isn't a novel idea. There was automation with LIMS all the way back to 1982, even with limited technical capabilities that existed in the computers at that time. So what about ELN, electronic laboratory notebooks? What's the historical context on these? So this kind of is a decade later, even after LIMS came on the market, where they started discussing the idea of not using paper notebooks, using an electronic system to track, scientific experimentation. And then around 1997, actually Kodak, believe it or not, created an ELN on top of Lotus Notes. And this became the kind of first ELN that existed on the market. And also there was a regulatory change that came around the same time where the federal government agencies would acknowledge that they would consider an electronic experimental record as valid as a paper notebook. So this really allowed for the introduction of ELNs on the market because now you could back up patent claims, et cetera, with your electronic version of your notebook, just as you could with a paper notebook, assuming it complied with certain requirements from the government. Okay, so when we actually look at a LIMS, what do people think a LIMS is? Well, they're generally thought to be sample-centric. So you have samples that are coming in the laboratory and they're being processed. So they're also request-centered. So LIMS are driven by requests, and you can think of a lab as a service provider, almost like a business unto itself. It's a service provider either internally at an organization where it's just servicing other employees within a pharmaceutical company, or for a clinical lab, they're exposed externally, their services, and then they're still getting a request, they're getting samples, and they're processing them. So they're very process-driven, right? You don't want the lab technicians freewheeling, right? You don't want them improvising on the pipeline because you want a very rote, repeatable process. So when the samples come in and you follow the prescribed process, that you get the proper results at the end of that pipeline. So what about ELN? What did generally people think about ELNs? Well, generally we think about materials now, that scientists are working with materials of some type, whether it's chemical, compound-oriented, small molecules, or more recently with things around the molecular biology domain, such as DNA or plasmids, biologics, et cetera. And here, it's really driven by the science, right? The scientists are driving what's going to happen in the system. They have a design of an experiment, they're going to execute on the experiment and hopefully discover something is their goal through this process. And you want the system to be science aware. In the LIMS, we didn't talk about science awareness, right? It didn't really matter. But in an ELN, you really, ideally the system has some elements of science awareness, whether it's the ability to design a molecule or to design a reaction or design a plasmid, for example, through some chem or mol bio type tools that are integrated in the system. So when you look at these two definitions, they look completely different, right? They look like, well, they're completely different systems. In fact, in how things have evolved. And the separation of time of introduction of these products is one reason there has been a division. The LIMS came on the market a decade earlier. The scientists said we have different needs and systems were introduced for that. So these, not only did conceptually they look different, but it's just the way the market worked out, they became two separate product domains that were there. But really, you have to look at this a little differently. So in reality, if you look at it, it turns out, well, lab technicians work with materials as well. Their materials may be different than what scientists are working with. So they're working typically with reagents, consumables, but they're materials nonetheless, just a different class of materials. Well, it turns out scientists don't just work with materials, they work with samples. I mean, if they're doing an experiment, at some point, they're gonna have to test their material in some biological sample, in vitro, in vivo, what have you, but they need samples to test and assess the effectiveness of their biologic or their small molecule, for example. And it turns out the scientists aren't always freewheeling. They're often working from a template that's prescribed and pre-built to kind of expedite their ability to kind of fill in the blanks in an experiment. So they will follow sometimes a template. And it turns out these templates, that experiment template, can look a lot like a workflow that a lab technician might follow in a LIMS domain on the bench, but allow for more freewheeling still for the scientists. So they have a template they start with, but they can still modify things, whereas in the lab, you might not allow that. But still, there's some similarity there in the concept of a template for an experiment and a template for a workflow. And then there's even more. I mean, both scientists and lab technicians store things, right? You have samples, the scientist isn't just taking it, handing it off and say, process these samples. There's intermediary storage places, freezers, et cetera. These are going to be a need to track that. Of course, you need to know where things are. You need to be able to find them. And a big common element between the scientific realm in the ELN and the LIMS is instrument data. Scientists, of course, are having assays run on their samples, and that data is critical to their understanding how things are working, dose response, et cetera, within their experiments. And in the lab, of course, the whole reason you're taking something through a lab pipeline is to get some instrument data result at the end. So this is a very important common element that's shared between the two systems. And then there's just other general metadata you want to track. When you're in the LIMS world on the bench, there's other general metadata you track about the process, and it could be structured. It typically is structured there. And scientists might want to track structured. They often are tracking unstructured data as well, and that's fine. You don't get a lot of unstructured data in the LIMS world. But in the ELN world, there could be unstructured data, but there's also other key data, especially if you want something to be searchable, should also be tracked in a structured way. So these are common elements. And it turns out there are a lot of common elements between LIMS and ELN, but there are some differences too, of course. So at Sapio, we engaged in a thought experiment about 5 years ago, which is, can a single system encompass the needs of both a lab for tracking process and in a very rote, repeatable way, and for scientists to kind of freewheel ad hoc in a science-aware system. It doesn't even make sense to do it. Is this even a worthwhile endeavor? Well, if you start to look at where the world's headed, which is this concept of the digital lab, and this is a slide from Accenture. We don't like the term digital lab. We prefer the term seamless lab. And you start to look at all the mandates of the digital lab, what your goals should be. It's really hard to do all these if you have distinct LIMS and ELN, because they're probably not going to be integrated. They certainly won't be integrated completely. And if they are integrated, it's going to be hard and costly, and it'll be a minimal integration, and that has to evolve over time as well. So it's much harder to realize the seamless lab if you have a bunch of distinct systems on the market or in your installation. So what are the benefits of a single system? And so we were doing the thought experiment. We said, well, what would the benefits be to our customers? Well, first is cost reduction. So if you have an integrated LIMS and ELN, it's significantly less than buying a LIMS and buying an ELN. And in reality, what people end up doing is they buy multiple different LIMS and multiple different ELNs at a large pharma, so it's even compounded more. And I'm sure there's some equation on the data silo effect and integration costs that's an exponential by the more systems that you purchase and buy. The integration costs are very easy to calculate if you have an integrated system. There's zero. And this is one of the huge cost items. In fact, there could be dozens of people and a lot of technology purchased to try to integrate disparate systems at pharmaceutical companies or biotechs. And it's exceedingly hard because all the systems represent data differently. They're not common ways of doing things. So with an integrated system, the integration cost is zero. And that's easy to compute. You also get the advantage of single administrative skills. So think about all the LIMS administrators and ELN admins that exist for all the different solutions within a company. But if the LIMS and ELN are based on the same technology and in fact, the same engine drives the LIMS and ELN, then LIMS admins can be ELN admins and ELN admins can be LIMS admins because it's a single skill set. So administrators are not inexpensive resources these days, and often people are turning to consulting firms because they can't find people to do the technical work that they need done on these systems. So having a single administrative experience is another significant cost saving. So just these three right here can save millions of dollars annually in a larger installation. And you also get a single data store, and this is really one of our big drivers, is because our background and my background is in machine learning, and we're big believers in that data is your asset. Process is also one of your assets, but data is even a more valuable asset, and particularly sample data and instrument data. So these are the two most important things that you have that you're collecting, and you're collecting that data both in the ELN and in the LIMS context. But if they're not in a single repository, you're losing a great deal of benefit from that. And you want to make sure the system that they're in, if they are integrated, is searchable, so you can target search the data in the way you want, and provides visualizations of the data and integrated analytics. As the prior presentation talked about, machine learning is becoming prominent. So you want to have a system that embodies all of these. So now you can take advantage of this very valuable asset that you have, which is your data. And we're starting to see now pharmaceutical companies and biotech recognize that, okay, this is our asset, and they're starting to go through these digital transformation projects where they're recognizing that they can't have a bunch of different data stores, and that analytics is important. Knowing what we did last year on experiments and in the lab is important. But if you haven't had a system that allows that kind of searching and analytics, it was impossible essentially to find out even what has been done historically at your own company. So you completely lost the value of that asset that you spent a lot of money collecting.
2 minutes, Kevin.
Yes. So we've created the Seamless Lab from Sapio, where we in fact we do have a world-class ELN and LIMS on a single platform. And we have the benefit of all these data types: samples, containers, structured data, unstructured data, instrument data, storage, and materials, all tracked in a single repository, built on a scalable informatics platform. So here's our advice, okay? And you can take it or leave it. But it's super important to buy a platform, not a purpose-built application. What do we mean by that? We took the approach of creating a platform from the outset. A platform implies something that can become anything. A platform is actually application agnostic. So it's not LIMS or ELN or even CRM or some other domain. It's a flexible at the data layer and the interface layer to pretty much be able to do anything. And this allows you to be agile with the system to meet any need that you need. So it's extremely important to think about this aspect, because this is actually what you're buying when you buy a product. You're buying their architecture that underlies the system. And also, we highly suggest look beyond marketing hype. Vendors are quite good at marketing these days and infomercial demos, but you want to go deeper in your assessment of the LIMS and ELN capabilities. Make the vendor get out of their comfort zone, their structured demos, and do something specific to your requirements that you provide to them. So we created this platform, and I mentioned it has all these implicit benefits. And I don't have time to go through all these today, but I'll mention fully configurable at the data model layer. The devil's in the details on this, because many solutions do have some element of configurability here, but the devil's in the details. When you get into project-specific work, that's where these come to light. Going for low code, no code, avoid programming where you can, and having a rules engine is important, but also having a robust API so you can easily get data in and out. Fair compliance, very important. Integrated charting, data warehouse, powerful search, integrated chat. We're big believers in collaboration. and then wrapping everything in permissions. So this platform is application agnostic, but we've built on top of it LIMS, ELN, and STMS. So it's very important when you're assessing solutions, whether it's LIMS, ELN, or both, to not get caught up in a single feature that you like, because if you're buying a platform can easily add features and do it very fast. If you buy a purpose-built application, it's actually very hard to add features because they're not flexible at the underlying architectural layer. So this is why having a platform is critically important. And then over the 15 years we've been doing this, we recognized we needed vertical applications on top of these. So we've built a registration system, bioanalysis pipelines, genomics, stability formulations, histopath. We're doing parallel medicinal chem, protein engineering, and molecular biology now. All these are on the platform. But because they're built on top of the platform, again, we retain the ability to massage these. We're not locked into anything. We can massage these to particular needs. We can adapt them over time. And one thing that's 100% consistent in the LIMS and ELN world is there's 100% lack of agreement between our customers on how they want to do things. So flexibility is the hallmark of a successful solution in the LIMS and ELN domain because of the wide diversity of requirements that we see in the marketplace. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'll be glad to take questions if we have any.
Wonderful. In the interest of time, Kevin, what I will suggest is we've got a couple of questions that have come in. I will forward them on to you so you can follow up with those individuals directly. And obviously, for those of you who want to hear more about the work that Kevin has described, I'm sure Kevin and his team will be available to speak to you. So thank you very much, Kevin.